today's lesson, we will look at the techniques in reducing prejudice. So, coming to the objectives of this lesson. So, the first objective is to understand the various techniques in reducing prejudice. So, there are different techniques, and under techniques we look at contact hypothesis, re-categorization, benefit of guilt, saying no to stereotypes, and social influence. So, in our previous classes, we have looked at what prejudice is, causes, sources, effects, and elements of prejudice. But how do we combat prejudice? In today's class, we will look at techniques in prejudice. And why do we need to look at techniques in prejudice? Why are they important? So, now we will look at the different techniques in reducing prejudice. The first one is the contact hypothesis. The contact hypothesis was developed in the middle of the 20th century by researchers to understand how conflict and prejudice could be reduced. Studies conducted in the year 1940 and 50s showed that the contact with members of other groups was related to lower levels of prejudice. In one study, 1951, researchers looked at how living in segregated or desegregated housing units was related to prejudice and found that in New York, where housing was desegregated, white study participants reported lower prejudice than white participants in Newark, where housing was still segregated. Gordon Allport, one of the key early theorists who published the influential book The Nature of Prejudice in 1954, reviewed previous research on intergroup contact and prejudice and found that contact reduced prejudice in some instances. But it wasn't a panacea when there were also cases where intergroup contact made prejudice and conflict worse. To understand how contact worked to reduce prejudice successfully, Allport developed 4 conditions. These were studied later by the researchers. And according to Gordon Allport, contact between groups is most likely to reduce prejudice. 4 conditions are met. So, the first condition is the members of the 2 groups have equal status. And Allport believed that contact in which members of one group are treated as subordinate wouldn't reduce prejudice, and it could actually make things worse. So, for example, high and low class. When people from high and low class are treated equally, then there wouldn't be any conflict. And the next condition is the members of the 2 groups have common goals. For example, in BA class, that is BA Psychology and BA Mass Communication, have a common goal to do well in academics and score good marks. The next condition is the members of 2 groups work cooperatively. Allport wrote that only the type of contact that leads to people to do things together is likely to result in changed attitude. For example, limited resources can make an individual to work together, like we see in the robber's cave experiment. When resources were limited, people tend to come together and work for the goal. And the next condition is there is institutional support for the contact. For example, if the group leaders or authority figures support the contact between groups. According to Pettigrew, in the year 1997, increased contact between various groups can reduce prejudice between them. If the groups are met on a regular basis, there would be a possibility of acceptance, recognition, and esteem. The similarities between the groups would help in growing and developing together. And research conducted by Van Dyck and others in the year 2004 has found that linguistic groups throughout Europe had increased cooperation and favored by the group reduced prejudice. And according to Wokai, in the year 2007, People who were friends with homosexuals or heterosexuals were found to have developed a more favorable attitude, less anxiety in their interactions, and closeness towards gay men and others. Psychologist John Dovidio and his colleagues found that contact may reduce prejudice because it changes how we categorize others. One effect of contact is de-categorization. That means, which involves seeing someone as an individual rather than as a member of their group. Another outcome of contact can be re-categorization, in which people no longer see someone as a part of a group that they are in conflict with, but rather as a member of a larger shared group. The contact hypothesis was used to show how desecration would increase the self-esteem of racial minorities and decrease the prejudice of whites. Unfortunately, studies of the effects of school desegregation have not always produced encouraging findings. Some studies conducted during and immediately following the court's decision showed that desecration actually increased whites' prejudice towards blacks and has little effect on the self-esteem of black children. Several reasons for these findings is that interracial contact in desegregated schools was not always equal, nor was it implemented with full social support. The contact hypothesis has been used in creating cooperative learning programs to improve intergroup relations. The most famous type of cooperative learning program is referred to as a jigsaw classroom method. The jigsaw classroom refers to a technique that creates a classroom atmosphere in which students of different racial and ethnic groups are placed in pursuit of a common goal. Specifically, students are placed in diverse 6-person learning groups. The lesson is divided into 6 segments and each student is assigned one segment of the lesson. In essence, each student holds, so to speak, one piece of the jigsaw. To complete the entire lesson, the students must rely on the knowledge of the other individuals in their group, thereby facilitating the interdependence that is needed to improve intergroup relations. In the jigsaw classroom, students work cooperatively toward a common goal in a context where there is implicit institutional support given by the teacher. And students in jigsaw classrooms compared to those in traditional classrooms showed decreased prejudice and stereotyping, and minority students showed an increase in self-esteem. Moreover, students in jigsaw classrooms showed a genuine display of integration even outside of the classroom, such as on the playground, by their willingness to interact with members outside of their racial and ethnic group. The next technique in reducing prejudice is re-categorization. Re-categorization is the psychological breaking down of barriers between people. For example, if a school was playing inter-school volleyball tournament, then they would see the opponent for the other school as different. But when the players are selected from different schools to play for a particular state, then instead of looking at people from different schools, they would see them as similar to them as they are playing together. This shift from different to similar is called re-categorization. Common in-group identity models suggested that individuals who view themselves to a similar group can reduce the intergroup conflict. And the research on intergroup contact suggests that though it is effective, if it is not implemented, then the situation might go bad. Jason Nair and his colleagues in the year 2001 found that wearing a same hat as those of the same team members at a football match had gained more acceptance than being in the group. John, Samuel and others in the year 2002 worked on the recategorization model by investigating the effects of recategorization on intergroup behavior, specifically helping and self-disclosure as well as evaluation. Participants first worked as members of 2-3 person groups, and then the two groups interacted under conditions designed to enhance a two-group representation or recategorization with an inclusive one-group representation. As expected, manipulation of the intergroup contact situation that created stronger impressions of one group reduced intergroup bias in evaluation, self-disclosure and helping. Furthermore, ratings of the extent to which the 6 participants felt like one group mediated the reduction in bias, particularly for evaluative bias. Conditions facilitating the generalization of the benefits of recategorization to group members not present and to the other groups were also considered. And benefits of recategorization are not just confined to laboratory settings, but they also appear in our everyday interactions with other people. The next technique of reducing prejudice is benefits of guilt. When people are challenged about their views and behavior, it can lead to the individual feeling guilty for not living up to their personal standards. According to Powell, Smith and others in the year 2005, collective guilt can reduce prejudice. In simple terms, guilt is an individual's response to doing something wrong. And according to Willard Gallen, guilt is the emotion that shapes so much of one's goodness and generosity. It signals an individual when they have transgressed from codes of behavior that they personally want to sustain. Feeling guilty informs an individual that they have failed their own ideals. And researchers found that framing inequality as reflecting as white advantage increased collective guilt and reduced racism. For example, copying in exam. When one student is caught and reprimanded for copying in exam, others also tend to learn a lesson. But if the whole class is caught copying in the exam, the class would be scolded, and that leads to reflecting as to what made them to commit this act and not to repeat next time. Ayer and others in the year 2003 studied guilt as a response to a group-based advantage. Consistent with its conceptualization as a self-focused emotion, white guilt was based in self-focused beliefs in racial inequality. The findings demonstrated that the benefits and limits of group-based guilt as a basis of support for social equality and highlight the value of understanding the specific emotions elicited in intergroup contexts. In a study conducted by Dennis Regan and his colleagues in the year 1972, students were led to believe that they had broken another person's camera, which in turn made them feel guilty. Then another person presented a need for help. As predicted, the students who were feeling guilty were more likely to help the second person than were those who were not feeling guilty. Thus, participants who unintentionally harmed one person ended up being more helpful to another person who had nothing to do with the original source of the guilt. This situation illustrated the function of guilt, which is an individual tends to feel guilty when he or she thinks that he or she has harmed the relationships with others, and the guilt reminds that they need to work to repair these transgressions. Advertisers sometimes tend to invoke guilt to get people to contribute to charitable causes. This approach is particularly effective when people feel that they are able to engage in the necessary helping. The next technique in reducing prejudice is saying no to stereotypes. Researchers conducted an experiment among two groups to study the effects of saying no to stereotypes. The participants were shown photographs of white and blacks with respective stereotyped words like ambitious or uptight for white and athletic and poor for blacks, and were asked to respond by saying yes and no. It was found that stereotypes can be reduced through negation training. According to Myers, in the year 2010, repeatedly pairing an external attribution for a negative behavior can reduce racial stereotyping. According to Dovido and others in the year 2000, have conducted a study to examine the effect of training in negation stereotype associations on stereotype activation. And across the 3 studies, participants received practice in negating stereotypes related to skinhead and racial categories. The subsequent automatic activation of stereotypes were measured using either a primed Stroop task or through a person's categorization task. The results demonstrated that when receiving no training or training in a non-target category stereotype, participants exhibited spontaneous stereotype activation. After receiving an extensive amount of training related to a specific category, participants demonstrated a reduced stereotype activation. The results from the training task provided further evidence for the impact of practice on participants' proficiency in negating stereotypes. Brandon, Kopp and others in the year 2016 have conducted a study to compare the effectiveness of meaningful negation, that's wrong, and simple negation, no, to alter automatic prejudice. Participants were trained to negate prejudice consistent or prejudice inconsistent information using either simple or meaningful negation, and completed an evaluative priming measure of racial prejudice before and after training. The present research suggested that negation can be effective when the negation is meaningful, contrary to the research suggesting that the negation training as an ineffective means to reduce automatic racial prejudice. Srividya Ramasubramaniam in the year 2007 conducted a study which focused on the role of media in facilitating and inhibiting the accessibility of stereotypes primed by race-related news stories. It examined experimentally the effects of 2 strategies for reducing stereotype accessibility: an audience-centered approach that explicitly instructed audience to be critical media consumers, which is a goal of media literacy training, and a message-centered approach using stereotype disconfirming counter stereotypical news stories. Participants viewed either a literacy or control video before reading stereotypical or counter stereotypical news stories about African Americans or Asian Indians. Implicit stereotypes were measured using response latencies to hostile and benevolent stereotypical words in a lexical decision task. Results suggested that a combination of audience-centered and message-centered approach may reduce racial stereotypes which were activated by news stories. The next technique of reducing prejudice is social influence. Social influence plays an important role in maintaining and reducing prejudice. Members of a particular group like a member of another group, there are chances of reducing prejudice. It was found that stereotypes of the groups in which low power people were influenced by powerful people's judgment and behavior when stereotypes were endorsed by powerful people and matched powerful people's goals. Lowery and others in the year 2001 conducted a study on the control of automatic prejudice, which focused on efficacy of deliberate attempts to suppress or correct stereotyping, and the reported experiments tested the hypothesis that automatic racial prejudice is subject to common social influence. In experiments involving actual inter-ethnic contact, both tacit and express social influence reduce the expression of automatic prejudice as assessed by two different measures of automatic attitudes. Moreover, the automatic social tuning effect depended on the participant ethnicity. And some of the other ways to reduce prejudice is through awareness for anti-prejudice social norms, making people aware of inconsistencies in their own beliefs, increased contact with members of other social groups, and passing of laws and regulations which require fair and equal treatment for all the groups of people. So, in our today's lesson, we have seen various techniques in reducing prejudice, and the most important being awareness and also identifying what prejudice is, through which we can reduce prejudice. The effects of prejudice can be lasting. To help an individual to overcome the impact of various methods are employed. By employing these methods, an individual would be able to manage and help themselves and others in dealing with prejudice originating from various factors.